Hey, crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with some more psychology and what's probably going to be the last set of our explorations in this format. We will be reading aloud from Carl Jung's Aion. It's not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it. Uh, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. I'm trying to go, right? We're going to do housekeeping. Um, But first, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there are several playlists linked in the box down below so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. If you find value, I ask that you do all of the wonderful things down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow, throw me a comment, whether or not whether you agree or disagree. If you put it in the box and it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. In addition to that, if you truly find value, I ask that you hit me with the super thanks, super chat. Consider joining for a membership or picking up a copy of one of my books. Uh, with that being said, let's do the housekeeping before we dive into Eon. This will most likely be the last study in this format. We were already ready to pivot, right? At the beginning of the year, I was already ready to pivot. I just didn't know which direction. Nothing had fully solidified yet. And it's starting to. Uh, I'm going to be doing public speaking, right? That is the goal. And it's apparently where this has all been headed. This has been school, right? Learning things so that I can define the message, I refine the message, and now it is time to get it out there. We have gone through the 4-part cycle. It is time for projection, right? We're going to continue doing videos, but it's no longer going to be the studies in the same format. Some people will be very happy to hear that, and I understand that because, once again, this is not the format for everyone. This was school for me. This was me learning and integrating the things that I needed to in order to be able to speak intellectually, right, with intelligence and maybe a little bit of wisdom on the things that I am discussing. It doesn't like the things that have come from these studies have been entirely positive, and I will be continuing to study on my own. But this is not the format for everyone, and if I'm going to get the message out to as many people as possible, then we need to change, right? Then it's no longer going to be reading aloud and discussing as we go along. We'll try and change the format up a little bit. I am still a little bit undetermined what that will be. But I am pivoting myself towards preparation for public speaking. That was one of the reasons for going live, right? This is a simulated audience, but I have a high degree of empathy. I can put myself in the position of there are a million people watching, and it is highly anxiety inducing, but it is something I am able to work through, and I am working through. I am doing a lot of internals, right? Those who know, you know. Uh, I have stretched myself significantly over the course of the last 2 months, and it is going to continue into next month for sure. But it all is all geared towards getting in front of people. So I'm getting the presentations ready. All of those presentations will be here, and we will do those here first, and then they will be available for, hey, let's do this live. Uh, on a variety of subjects. I have quite a few things to talk about. Um, but I just wanted to let those who are interested in these studies know, right? There's not many people who are actually interested in me reading, right? This has been vocal therapy. My voice is great, right? I can talk for a couple of hours at a time. If I'm not trying to project, I am still working on like the frequency and the volume, keeping it consistent. But for the most part, my voice is doing wonderful, so I don't really need the vocal therapy in the same way. Hey, brother, how's it going? I am just diving, like I'm pointing out that this is probably the last study that I'm going to be doing in this particular manner. Right after this particular study with Eon, I'm more than likely going to be doing almost entirely my stuff using, various examples, but I'm unsure how exactly I'm going to be putting that together. But this will probably be the last study that we do reading aloud. And now we're going to read aloud. I hope you're doing well today. Oh, wait, let me do this before I get involved. I want the comments to show up, and there's no way to set the default for this, so I have to set it manually every time. And my SI is shit. So, all right, forward. The theme of this work is the idea of Eon. My investigation seeks, with the help of Christian, Gnostic, and alchemical symbols of the self, to throw light on the change of psychic situation within the Christian Aeon. Christian tradition from the outset is not only saturated with Persian and Jewish ideas about the beginning and end of time. I'm going to enjoy this one, right? But it is filled with intimations of a kind of enantiodromian reversal of dominance. Uh, Persian and Jewish, as well as Indian, is definitely present in pretty much all of the Christian symbology. Uh, I mean by this the dilemma of Christ and Antichrist. Probably most of the historical speculations about time and the divisions of time were influenced, as the apocalypse shows, by astrological ideas. It is therefore only natural that my reflection should gravitate mainly around the symbol of the fishes. For the Pisces eon is the synchronistic concomitant of the 2,000 years of Christian development. In this time period, not only was the figure of Anthropos, the Son of Man, progressively amplified symbolically and thus assimilated psychologically, but it brought with it changes in man's attitude that had already been anticipated by the expectation of the Antichrist in the ancient texts. Because these texts were relegated to the appearance of Antichrist to the end of time, we are justified in speaking of a Christian eon, which it was presupposed would find its end with the second coming. It seems as if this expectation coincides with the astrological conception of the Platonic month of the fishes. Uh, it is almost it is almost a certainty that they were talking about the way that they were following, right, would come to fruition with the fall of the Roman Empire, right? Uh, it is very likely that the apocalypse, the revelation, was referring to the fall of Rome. The Nero was the beast, and there were reasons why the correlates were those things. Right? They correlate specifically to the history. Uh, it is dealing mainly with the area of Gog and Magog, which is Turkey. None of the churches were outside of modern day Turkey. All of them were inside of there. All 12 churches or the Revelation, right? Um, and so, anyway, the second coming, most likely to the people who were the believers at that point in time, was this, that Rome was going to fall because whether it was a prophecy or they were just very good at reading the energies, right? The things that were politically brewing in the area. That is what happened right around 78, 70 to 80. I think it was around 78 AD, right? That was within the lifetime, within the generation that was then. And the symbology fits for a variety of reasons of the Whore of Babylon and all of that. And so it is entirely likely that they were foreseeing the coming of the age to be Rome falls, Judaism falls, and we replace both of them with this current religion. Well, that's not the way it shook out, right? Rome did fall, right? At least the way it was, and like, and so that part happened. Judaism was kind of dispensed with, right? The temple was torn, the stones were cast away, they were dispersed from the lands. All of that happened, but the Christianity did not replace it, especially not in the form that it existed at that period in time, uh, in the way that they were wanting it to. Right? They were foreseeing that the coming would be that they would be living in the age of Jesus, with Jesus there with them about 100 AD. And, and then they would have 2,000 years, the time of the fishes, to be with him. And that is the best way of looking at that. Uh, it's not the only way. There are definitely other ways of looking at that. But I do believe that does shed a little bit of light. And those are recent revelations for me, right? If you go back to my study in Revelation, that is definitely not where I was at all in that. And so I have my views constantly evolving too. All right, back to the time. I'm not wearing the glasses. I'm not needing them as much. So, the immediate occasion for my proposing to discuss these historical questions is the fact that the archetypal image of wholeness, which appears so frequently in the products of the unconscious, had its forerunners in history. These were identified very early with the figure of Christ, as I have shown in my book, Psychology and Alchemy. I have been requested so often by my readers to discuss the relations between the traditional Christ figure and the natural symbols of wholeness, or the self, that I finally decided to take this task in hand. Considering the unusual difficulties of such an undertaking, my decision did not come easily to me, for in order to surmount all of the obstacles and possibilities of error, a knowledge and caution would be needed, which, unfortunately, are vouchsafed me only in limited degree. I am moderately certain of my observations on the empirical material, but I am fully aware of the risk I am taking in drawing the testimonies of history into the scope of my reflections. I think I also know the responsibility I'm taking upon myself when, as though continuing the historical process of assimilation, I add to the many symbolical amplifications of the Christ figure yet another, the psychological one, or even, it might seem, reduce the Christ symbol to a psychological image of wholeness. My readers should never forget, however, that I am not making a confession of faith or writing a tendacious tract, but I am simply considering how certain things could be understood from the standpoint of our modern consciousness, things which I deem it valuable to understand, and which are obviously in danger of being swallowed up in the abyss of incomprehension and oblivion. Things, finally, whose understanding would do much to remedy our philosophic disorientation by shedding light on the psychic background and secret chambers of the soul. The essence of this book was built up gradually in the course of many years in countless conversations with people of all ages and all walks of life, with people who, in the confusion and uprootedness of our society, were likely to lose all contact with the meaning of European culture and to fall into that state of suggestibility, which is the occasion and cause of utopian mass psychoses of our time. Well, 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 was he a prophet? Right? Like, where are we at now? Right? Have we lost, like, not me, the meaning of the European culture and fall into a state of suggestibility for the cause of utopian mass psychoses? You could definitely make that argument looking at the current state of Europe. Okay? I write as a physician with a physician sense of responsibility and not as a proselyte. Nor do I write as a scholar. Otherwise, I would wisely barricade myself behind the safe walls of my specialism and not, on account of my inadequate knowledge of history, expose myself to critical attack and damage my scientific reputation. So far as my capacities allow, restricted as they are by old age and illness, I have made every effort to document my material as reliably as possible and to assist the verification of my conclusions by citing the sources. Carl Jung, May 1950. All right, we got a long way to scroll here. Good morning, Jen. How you doing today? These things came to pass, they say, that Jesus might be made the first sacrifice in the discrimination of composite natures. Hippolytus and Lynkeos 7, 27, 8. All right. All right, number one, the ego. Investigation of the psychology of the unconscious confronted me with facts which require the formulation of new concepts. One of these concepts is the self. The entity so denoted is not meant to take the place of the one that has always been known as the ego, but includes it in a supraordinate concept. We understand the ego as the complex factor to which all conscious contents are related. Informs, as it were, the center of the field of consciousness, and, insofar as this comprises the empirical personality, the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. The relation of a psychic content to the ego forms the criterion of its consciousness, for no content can be conscious unless it is represented to a subject. With this definition, We have described and delimited the scope of the subject. Theoretically, no limits can be set to the field of consciousness since it is capable of indefinite extension. Empirically, however, it always finds its limit when it comes up against the unknown. This consists of everything we do not know, which, therefore, is not related to the ego as the center of the field of consciousness. The unknown falls into two groups of objects: those which are outside and can be experienced by the senses, and those which are inside and are experienced immediately. The first group comprises the unknown in the center world, in the outer world. The second, the unknown in the inner world. We call this latter territory the unconscious. The ego, as a specific content of consciousness, is not simple or elementary factory, but a complex one, which, as such, cannot be described exhaustively. Experience shows that it rests on two seemingly different bases: the somatic and the psychic. The somatic basis is inferred from the totality of endosomatic perceptions, which, for their part, are already of psychic nature and are associated with the ego, and are, therefore, conscious. They are produced by endosomatic stimuli, only some of which cross the threshold of consciousness. A considerable portion of these stimuli occur unconsciously, that is, subliminally. The fact that they are subliminal does not necessarily mean that their status is merely physiological, any more than this would be true of a psychic content. Sometimes they are capable of crossing the threshold, but that is, of becoming perceptions. But there is no doubt that a large proportion of these endosomatic stimuli are simply incapable of consciousness and are so elementary that there is no reason to assign them a psychic nature, unless, of course, one favors the philosophical view that all life processes are psychic anyway. The chief objection to this hardly demonstrable hypothesis is that it enlarges the concept of the psyche beyond all bounds and interprets the life process in a way not absolutely warranted by the facts. Concepts that are too broad usually prove to be unsuitable instruments because they are too vague and nebulous. I have, therefore, suggested that the term psychic be used only where there is evidence of a will capable of modifying reflex or instinctual processes. Here, I must refer to my reader to my paper on the nature of the psyche, where I have discussed this definition of psychic at somewhat greater length. The somatic basis of the ego consists then of conscious and unconscious factors. The same is true of the psychic basis. On the one hand, the ego rests on the total field of consciousness, and on the other, on the sum total of unconscious contents. These fall into three groups. First, temporarily subliminal contents that can be reproduced voluntarily. Memory. Second, unconscious contents that cannot be reproduced voluntarily. And third, contents that are not capable of becoming conscious at all. Group 2 can be inferred from the spontaneous eruption of subliminal contents into consciousness. Group 3 is hypothetical. It is a logical inference from the facts underlying the Group 2. It contains contents which have not yet erupted into consciousness or which never will. When I said that the ego rests on the total field of consciousness, I do not mean that it consists of this. Were that so, it would be indistinguishable from the field of consciousness as a whole. The ego is only the latter's point of reference, grounded on and limited by the somatic factor described above. Although its bases are, in themselves, relatively unknown and unconscious, the ego is a conscious factor par excellence. It is even acquired, empirically speaking, during the individual's lifetime. It seems to arise in the first place from the collision between the somatic factor and the environment, and once established as a subject, it goes on developing from further collisions with the outer world and the inner. Despite the unlimited context of its basis, the ego is never more and never less than consciousness as a whole. As a conscious factor, the ego could, theoretically at least, be described completely. But this would never amount to more than a picture of the conscious personality. All those features which are unknown and unconscious to the subject would be missing. A total picture would have to include these, but a total description of the personality is, even in theory, absolutely impossible because the unconscious portion of it cannot be grasped cognitively. We're, we're almost to a stop. And this unconscious portion, and as experience has abundantly shown, is by no means unimportant. On the contrary, the most decisive qualities in a person are often unconscious and can be perceived only by others, or have to be laboriously discovered with outside help. All right. And so now we get to dive into my favorites, right? Me. This is my way of thinking about this is like a computer. Now, I've been refining this over the last couple of weeks, but it does really seem to be this way, right? Now, you can look at the self as the total computer, the uh every bit of it, right? The hard drive, the tower, the monitor, the mouse, the keyboard, everything involved with the computer would be the self. The ego would be the cursor, right? That is the part that you use to navigate. You can see mine over here on the black spot moving around. That is me deciding to move. That is me deciding what to do. And I can go and I can choose things, right, as a conscious choice. And that is the ego. The unconscious is the next layer down. That's the desktop. That is the program that you're using to translate all the other stuff. And whichever program that you have at the moment, right now I have open the Brave tab, which for this particular word, but I can change it to this tab, right? I can focus in on this. Now, that is me choosing my unconscious to look at. But the unconscious contains a whole lot more. And I don't know how to share the desktop, but the desktop has a wide variety of icons, right? It contains all of the stuff just a little bit lower down, right? You have to choose to get to the part that brings it to the top, and it'll come to the top, and you can focus in on that. But all of that other stuff is still there. It is still underlying. It is still on the desktop. All of those other programs are still wrote into the hard drive. From the desktop, you are getting the translation from Windows or whatever your operating system is. Most people is Windows. And so Windows translates from the binary into something that you can use, right? And helps you to focus in on that one particular part. But Windows holds all of these folders. All of those folders are there in Windows, deeper. That's going to be the subconscious. But they are drawing from something even deeper than that. And that something even deeper than that is the base code upon which all code is written. That is the binary. That will be coming up later as the syzygy, right? The divine polar opposites, positive, negative, masculine, feminine. That is the binary. The binary is the first choice down from the entirety of all, right? The first category is all things, right? The entire computer as an entire unit. The next step up from that is a subdivision into positive, negative, yes, no, the binary of existence. Well, we can't read the binary. We can read the program in Windows that is translated for us from the binary. And so the superconscious, which is the binary, contains all of the information. We just don't have it. We write into it when we choose to write into Windows words. It writes through the program into the binary, recording into the hard drive. That is everything. And so that is what existence is, right? The source is the computer. It is everything. It is the totality of all things, right? It is beyond the computer. But then you get the translation from the source into the choices of existence. And then you get the fracturing of those choices into a wide variety of things that you get to actively choose from. That's the current model that I'm working with. You for the self, there's more to it, right? There's so many definitions that can attach to it, but that I think that that's going to be an easy way for people to grasp these four layers. And these four layers stem from the self or from the source, right? The source is where it begins, and it goes all the way out. On the other end of the line is the self, and that is you making those choices. Right? Well, there's a bar graph, right? If you got 2 points, there's a comparison between the 2 points. And so that comparison between those 2 points is where life exists, right? It is balancing between you and between the needs of all, source and self, in a way that is progressive and productive for all people. Um, so, uh, from that we can no longer need to stop as we're going along, because there's still a good bit of information to get through today, but that's a fairly good way of doing and looking at these ideas as we're going forward, right? He just said the same thing, right? That the unconscious portion can't be grasped cognitively. Like, you can't have all of the tabs open at once. You can't have all of the programs running at the same time. Windows is doing its job by giving you the one that you need right now. When we get into the mental problems, right? When we get into ADHD, for example, well, that's just pop-ups, right? You've got a virus that is causing shit to just pop up, and you can't really stop it, right? Until you learn how to run a virus protector upon yourself and order your brain. I mean, the same with I'm hyper focused. Well, maybe you need a control alt delete, move the end of task so that you can focus on something new. Maybe there's something holding you back and you need to figure out how to get a grip on that so that you can ground yourself and get to a new task and no longer focus in this particular way. All of that is possible from understanding why your brain is messing up. First, not for everybody, right? Some people need externals, but for me personally, once I got a feeling of, oh, well, that's where this stems from, now I can fix it. And what I have been doing over here is simply trying to define that. How do we fix it? And I think I got it. I think I got a fairly good start anyway. All right, back to the text. Clearly, then, the personality as a total phenomenon does not coincide with the ego, that is, with a conscious personality, but forms an entity that has to be distinguished from the ego. Naturally, the need to do this is incumbent only on a psychology that reckons with the fact of the unconscious. But for such a psychology, the distinction is of paramount importance. Even for jurisprudence, it should be of some importance whether certain psychic facts are conscious or not. For instance, in a judge in the question of responsibility, I have suggested calling the total personality, which, though present, cannot be fully known, the self. The ego is, by definition, subordinate to the self and is related to it like a part of the whole. Inside the field of consciousness, it has, as we say, free will. But by this, I do not mean anything philosophical, only the well known psychological fact of free choice, or rather, the subjective feeling of freedom. But just as our free will clashes with necessity in the outside world, so also it finds its limits outside the field of consciousness in the subjective inner world, where it comes into conflict with the facts of the self. And just as circumstances or outside events happen to us and limit our freedom, so the self acts upon the ego like an objective occurrence, which free will can do very little to alter. Indeed, well known that the ego can not only do nothing against the self, but is sometimes actually assimilated by unconscious components of the personality that are in the process of development and is greatly altered by them. I don't know that I agree with that, right? I believe that most of what is being considered free will in this particular instance is really not, because in order for it to be a free choice, then you have to understand the options, right? And most people do not understand the options when it comes to understanding themselves in the way that this would be required, right? Uh, now, and so it is not really the free will that is limited, right? It is the knowledge that is limiting. It is the ignorance that is holding back. And that is something happening, right? Not having the tools, I believe, has probably been a conscious choice by powers in control for a variety of reasons. They have the ability to teach people how to regulate emotionally. They just don't. And so I don't know that I agree at all that free will can do very little to alter, right, anything. I mean, you can even alter circumstances happening to you through the way that you react to them. That's quite literally the definition of experience. And so I just don't know about that. It is, in the nature of the case, impossible to give any general description of the ego except a formal one. Any other mode of observation would have to take into account of the individuality which attaches to the ego as one of its main characteristics. Although the numerous elements composing this complex factor are, in themselves, everywhere the same, they are infinitely varied as regards clarity, emotional coloring, and scope. The result of their combination, the ego, is therefore, so far as one can judge, individual and unique, and retains its identity up to a certain point. Its stability is relative because far reaching changes of personality can sometimes occur. Alteration of this kind need not always be pathological, they can also be developmental and hence fall within the scope of the normal. Okay, well, that's pretty much the objection that I was having a minute ago. Since it is the point of reference for the field of consciousness, the ego is the subject of all successful attempts at adaptation, so far as these are achieved by the will. The ego, therefore, has a significant part to play in the psychic economy. Its position there is so important that there are good grounds for the prejudice that the ego is the center of the personality, and that the field of consciousness is the psyche per se. If we discount certain suggestive ideas in Leibniz, Kant, Schelling, and Schopenhauer, and the philosophical excursions of Carus and von Hartmann, it is only since the end of the 19th century that modern psychology, with its inductive methods, has discovered the foundations of consciousness and proved empirically the existence of a psyche outside of consciousness. With this discovery, the position of the ego, till then absolute, became relativized. That is to say, though it retains its quality as the center of the field of consciousness, it is questionable whether it is the center of the personality. It is part of the personality, but not the whole of it. As I have said, it is simply impossible to estimate how large or how small its share is, how free or how dependent it is on the qualities of the extra conscious psyche. We can only say that its freedom is limited and its dependence proved in ways that are often decisive. In my experience, one would do well not to underestimate its dependence on the unconscious. Naturally, there is no need to say this to persons who already overestimate the latter's importance. Some criterion for the right measure is afforded by the psychic consequences of a wrong estimate, a point of which we shall return to later on. We have seen that, from the standpoint of the psychology of consciousness, the unconscious can be divided into three groups of contents. But from the standpoint of the psychology of the personality, a twofold division ensues: an extra-conscious psyche, whose contents are personal, and an extra-conscious psyche, whose contents are impersonal and collective, that is, unconscious and subconscious. Or subconscious and superconscious. The first group comprises contents which are integral components of the individual personality and could therefore just as well be conscious. The second group forms, as it were, an omnipresent, unchanging, and everywhere identical quality or substrate of the psyche per se. That is, of course, no more than a hypothesis, but we are driven to it by the peculiar nature of the empirical material, not to mention the high probability that the general similarity of the psychic processes in all individuals must be based on an equally general and impersonal principle that conforms to law. Just as the instinct manifesting itself in the individual is only the partial manifestation of an instinctual substrate common to all men. 2. The shadow. Whereas the contents of the personal unconscious are acquired during the individual's lifetime, the contents of the collective unconscious are invariably archetypes that were present from the beginning. Their relation to the instincts have been discussed elsewhere. Before we go too much farther, and the archetypes are defining groups, right? They are the way to say this group of things. Set theory is another way of looking at it. And in that, right, you have the set of creation, right? That is the archetype of all things. And then you have from that the division, right? From all things comes the division of this and that. Yes and no, positive and negative. That's where the archetypes really are, right? It is the container of all the subgroups of other things. And so you have the archetype of masculine, you have the archetype of feminine, and that is one of the primary archetypes. That is also the same as positive and negative, or creative and destructive, or a wide variety of others. Sun and moon, right? All of these are the primary division into yes, no, the binary. That group of the binary is the archetypes. Right? There are subgroups from that. You have the positive and negative masculine, you have the positive and negative feminine, expressed in a wide variety of ways, right? Warrior, guardian, tyrant, and all of these are expressions of the masculine. Matron, mother, crone, right? All of these are expressions of the feminine. Positive and negative expressions exist for all of those, and they are contained within the archetype of masculine, feminine. Right? It is the male archetype, the female archetype, the positive archetype, the negative archetype. That's the real archetypes. Everything below that is a subset of those archetypes. So the hero is a subset of the masculine in the same way that the tyrant is a subset of the masculine. They are each considered their own archetypes, but they are really a subset of the other archetype. And so the archetypes are most clearly characterized from the empirical point of view are those which have the most frequent and most disturbing influence on the ego. These are the shadow, the anima, and the animus. The most accessible of these and the easiest to experience is the shadow, for its nature can in large measure be inferred from the contents of the personal unconscious. The only exceptions to this rule are those rather rare cases where the positive qualities of the personality are repressed, and the ego, in consequence, plays an essentially negative or unfavorable role. All right, now, here's where we get into some differentiation between me and you. The anima, in my understanding, is going to be the anima is the subconscious, I believe, and the animus. No, I got that backwards. The anima is the part that is choosing, right? It is the anima is the part that is choosing the binaries, yes or no, positive or negative. The animus is the part that is providing the binaries. It is giving you the choice of this is positive and you can choose it. This is negative and you can choose it. I believe that it expresses itself as the internal voices of conscious and temptation. One says, you should fold your clothes. The other says, just sit here and watch Netflix. You get to choose which one of those you listen to, and you say, I'm going to fold my clothes. Or you say, I'm going to sit on here and watch Netflix. Either one of those can be the right choice at any given point in time, or it could be the wrong choice at any given point in time. That is entirely dependent upon your situation. And so they are not necessarily positive and negative in that particular way. They're the voice of this is change. This is what you can do to change your life, and this is what you can do to keep your life the same. Change and stasis, positive and negative. The negative being the stay the same, feminine. The masculine is going to be, hey, take this, change. And so for me, the animus is divided. It is both the positive and the negative. It is the part that is providing you the choice. The anima is the part taking the choice. And the shadow is really just an expression of the animus. It is the darker side of the animus, whereas he has it separated, with the animus being more of the positive drive and the shadow being more of the negative. For me, those are the same. Right? They are both the animus in the same way that Mercurius is both the positive and the negative. It is both the masculine and the feminine. And when we're talking about alchemy, it is the same thing. And so, uh, that is a terminology difference that we're going to have. I'm not going to try and hammer that as we move forward. That's why I'm trying to point it out as we go right now. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involved recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is the essential condition for any kind of self knowledge, and it, therefore, as a rule, meets with considerable resistance. Indeed, self knowledge, as a psychotherapeutic measure, frequently requires much painstaking work, extending over a long period. This is the first 8 weeks of my 24-week recommended course. Right? And that's not a course that you purchase, that is a course that you practice, right? You learn everything in about an hour, hour and a half. And then you put it into practice over the course of about 24 weeks, 8 weeks, identifying these dark things within yourself that you need to balance with a little bit of light. And then spending 8 weeks identifying that light side where you need to darken it a little bit. And that is the negredo, the albedo. Then you get to the rubido, where you're combining these things together and balancing them out through a series of checkpoints. And then you're ready for projection, which is the citronellus part. And so this is the first step, right? When I'm talking about what I do and the things that we are going to be talking about considerably going forward from this study, this is the first part right here. Closer examination of the dark characteristics, that is, the inferiorities constituting the shadow, reveals that they have an emotional nature, a kind of autonomy, and accordingly, an obsessive, or better, possessive quality. Emotion, incidentally, is not an activity of the individual, but something that happens to him. Wait, what was that? Emotion, incidentally, is not an activity of the individual, but something that happens to him. I think I agree with that. Affect occurs usually where adaptation is weakest, and at the same time, they reveal the reason for its weakness, namely, a certain degree of inferiority and the existence of a lower level of personality. Right? Emotions are more instinctual, right? And that's why I do agree. It is more something that happens for you. Oh, how I wish the process were that simple for me. All is mental, and we are limited by the limitations that we place upon ourselves first, foremost, and primarily. Just saying. Emotion and expression there is reactive. Yeah. Yeah, like when you feel anger, that is a reaction from wrath, letting you know something about your base existence, right? That is saying, hey, this situation is a little bit dangerous. This situation is not correct in a way that I feel needs to be rectified pretty quickly, right? And it is something that happens to you. You feel the emotion, and then you get to choose how you react to it. Exactly correct. And so, how you say what you are feeling is entirely dependent upon you. Now, there can be significant blocks to freely expressing your emotions. I'm still working through a lot of those these days, more these days than I have before. Uh, but you are making a choice if you choose to repress your emotions instead of expressing them in a healthy way. And you are making a choice if you choose to express them in an unhealthy way. So the expression is entirely up to you. On this lower level, within uncontrolled or scarcely controlled emotions, one behaves more or less like a primitive, who is not only the passive victim of his affects, but also singularly incapable of moral judgment. Although, with insight and goodwill, the shadow can to some extent be assimilated into the conscious personality. Experience shows that there are certain features which offer the most obstinate resistance to moral control and prove almost impossible to influence. Here, here. It's funny because I'm working through a story in my own head, and I'm not really ready to present it yet, but this is directly relating to that about why I began this entire process, right? And it was to fix one specific issue within myself that is still not really fixed, right? I've fixed a whole lot of other things, but this one particular thing is proving to be almost impossible to influence. And it's directly related to the repression of emotions. And it's one of those things that I'm working through. So it is so very relevant to everything, but there's somebody else who is entitled to the conversation even before the crew is. So it's just funny. Reflexive response is less conscious, more intuitive. Yeah. Yeah. And like you were supposed to listen to your intuition. You are, but not succumb to it. These resistances are usually bound up with projections, which are not recognized as such, and their recognition is a moral achievement beyond the ordinary. While some traits peculiar to the shadow can be recognized without too much difficulty as one's own personal qualities, in this case, both insight and goodwill are unavailing because the cause of the emotion appears to lie, beyond all possibility of doubt, in the other person. No matter how obvious it may be to the neutral observer that it is a matter of projections, there is little hope that the subject will perceive this himself. He must be convinced that he throws a very long shadow before he is willing to withdraw his emotionally toned projections from their object. That is another one of those very much truths, right? Reality is a mirror in a great variety of ways. And what you see, what you perceive in others is most often a reflection of the things about yourself that you want to correct, right? When you see something about someone else that makes you mad, for instance, it is probably pointing out something about yourself that you need to work on. But instead of that, you project upon this other person taking the exact same action that you do more often than not as something to be worthy of your vengeance, worthy of your wrath. And it's not most of the time. It is something that you are supposed to identify about yourself and fix about yourself. And that's one that most people have a problem with, right? The two most commons, right? The projection issue, it's not me, it's someone else. That is the problem, right? Thank you, Freud. And then the other one is I already am. I already know, right? I already know and I already am will keep you from progressing in almost anything, right? Somebody tries to give you some more information, I already know, right? And so you automatically dismiss any part of that viewpoint that might be different from yours. You won't even hear it when they give it to you because you have already assumed what they are going to say and you already think that you know what it will be. That right there will hold you back from attaining knowledge greatly. And it is directly related to the I already am, right? Somebody makes a suggestion that maybe you could do this particular thing to progress in your life. And you're like, I'm already doing that. No, you're not. If you were, nobody would need to point that out. And it is those two things right there will hold you back more from progression than anything else. If God knows us and knows our lives, how do we have free will? God, knowing all from before we are conceived, seems predetermined, which conflicts with free will. I have a video on this. It is the NPC in the multiverse. And I hold unconventional beliefs, and that is definitely one of them. I believe that we are here for the experience, right? We've talked about that already. Uh, and because we are here for the experience, there is no invalid experience. There is a series of choices, and that series of choices plays out in a myriad of ways. But none of those outcomes are necessarily good or bad. I mean, relatively speaking, they are, right? But for the consciousness, for the soul, if you die in a car wreck and it is horrific and painful, that is writing into the experience what it is like to die in a car wreck that is horrific and painful. It's not a pleasant experience. It's not one that you would request, but it is still a valid experience in the consciousness. And you made the decisions that led up to that even better. right? Now, sometimes you don't get to make those decisions. Sometimes it is part of karma or sacred contracts or however you want to look at it. I believe that we enter into those voluntarily on a soul level prior to incarnation. And so some of the choices are preset. Right? World War II was a preset choice for millions of people. You have those on an individual level that are relative to you and your spouse or to you and anybody that you have ever met. But you get to freely choose, right? This this path will lead you to your best life, and this path to a less one. But God doesn't care which one you take. He wants you to take the best one, right? And so it's not really a doesn't care, but if you choose through your free will to look at the bad side and to choose the bad side of things, which I did for a very long time, consciously choosing the bad side of things, then that's what he's going to give you, right? That is what you are asking for. And what does a good father do? He gives you what you ask for. If you are asking for unreliable friends because you hang around with unreliable people, then that is what is going to come into your life. If you are living a life of poverty because you spend frivolously, that is what is going to be in your life. But if you are making responsible choices, that is what you are meant to do, right? And because of that, you can be blessed a little bit more. Uh, and so all of those experiences are valid. And I also believe that they all play out, right? I believe that you make a variety of choices every single day that influences your path. But I also believe that there is a path that continues through the will of God without you as the conscious agent in it anymore, right? You are now an NPC in somebody else's game on that choice that you didn't make. You still exist as an entity, but not as the deciding factor. And so I believe that we're all on our own individual timelines, simply playing in the same game, right? And how you choose to complete the game and how I choose to complete the game doesn't have to be the same way, right? Some people are focused on grinding for the best, and some people are just relaxed and have fun, right? How we play the game is entirely up to us. But the game is still there. All of the options are still there. And so, since God has infinite capacity, I believe that He just plays this out in that way so that that experience gets written, but we're no longer the conscious choosing agent in that. We chose this path. And that can be complicated, right? That can be too much for some people. And I fully understand that. But for me, that just simply makes sense. Are we an extension of the God consciousness? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that. Right. I believe that God exists outside of the creation and he decided to make the creation for the experience of the creation. And so we are having an experience, our pets are having experiences, wild animals are having experiences, and all of those experiences are equally valid. And there is no real telling who is better for it, right? The lives that our pets lead in very many ways are better than ours, as far as worry and concern. And so uh, we are actually intentionally divided consciousnesses, right? I believe that God intentionally slivered off this little piece that is Jeremy Pittman. And so he slivered off the little piece that is my wife, and he slivered off the little piece that is my children. And Ah, that is with intention from the divine so that we can have the free experience of a life to express ourselves how we want to. And so that's how I do it. That's how I see it. Each experiencing their own unique realities in a very real way, but in a shared experience, right? There are things that you won't be able to change, and there are things that you absolutely can. And the bigger the scope, the less likely you are to be able to change them, right? World changing is very hard, right? Extremely hard. I do not recommend any of it, right? Uh, but changing your own personal situation is absolutely well within scope on astronomical levels, right? Simply and this is something like I have transformed my life in physicality, but not in materiality, right? Because I don't focus on that. And so for a lot of people, it's really hard to listen to a toothless guy who is rambling to the internet about things that I don't have material expression of. Ah, but I have literally transformed my reality. That is an absolute truth. And whether that is just through assimilation of the shadow in a cognitive manner, in the manner of Jung, or if it's the spiritual way that I believe, either one is equally valid. As long as the end product is balance, right? It doesn't really matter. Awareness of self has to come first. That is absolute truth, right? You have to be aware that you are an expression of the divine, that he wants you to have the best. You are just choosing the wrong things, and be willing to change, right? That is really the only things that are required. Uh, but being aware that I am this individual who is making these bad choices is absolutely the prerequisite. So I'm in agreement. Very good discussion. Very good discussion. Let us suppose that a certain individual shows no inclination whatever to recognize its projections. The projection making factor then has a free hand and can realize its object, if it has one, or bring about some other situation characteristic of its power. As we know, it is not the conscious subject, but the unconscious, which does the projecting. Hence, one meets with projections. One does not make them. The effect of projection is to isolate the subject from his environment, since instead of a real relation to it, there is now only an illusory one. Projections change the world into a replica of one's unknown face. In the last analysis, therefore, they lead to an autoerotic or autistic condition in which one dreams a world whose reality remains forever unattainable, getting stuck on them tabs. The resultant sentiment d'incomplétude and the still worse feeling of sterility are in their turn explained by projection as the malevolence of the environment, and by means of this vicious circle, the isolation is intensified. The more projections are thrust in between the subject and the environment, the harder it is for the ego to see through its illusions. A 45-year-old patient who has suffered from a compulsion neurosis since he was 20 and has become completely cut off from the world once said to me, "Well, I could never admit to myself that I've wasted the best 25 years of my life." That's another thing, too, right? Once you have committed to a level of ignorance, it is really hard to change it. Awareness of self is necessary equals ego. Yet, this is the biggest hurdle block keeping us from social cohesion. That's because certain people have been very determined to convince us that that is bad, that individuation is bad, that not conforming is bad, and that the ego in its totality is bad, right? Now, there is definite problems with giving way too much to egoism, right? Narcissists do exist. They are, for the most part, pretty horrible people who have no real concept of self. They don't have the it's so funny because they project the ego, but they really don't have the understanding of self that would be the ego. And so that's a funny thing. Uh, but yeah, uh, the biggest hurdle and block to society is not only that we are all individuals, right? That would do a lot, right? If we could get to the education system simply to recognize that people learn in different ways, right? That some people are auditory, some people are visual, some people are sensory and need to actually write it down, and some people don't. I mean, people learn in different ways, and if we can cater to the particular ways that people need to learn, then maybe we can teach them something. Oh, and so that's part of that. I mean, the understanding that each person is an individual. Right? It's easy to think that you are. It's much harder to think that the person that you hate is an individual. And but they are. They are making their own choices, and those choices are valid. They may not be what you would choose. You don't have to. You don't have to agree with them, but they are valid for their existence. They are valid for their perspective and their growth as a soul. And that will be the outgrowth of whatever actions they are taking. Now, that does not mean that they are getting it right. Right? So, auto, yeah, autodidacts too. Yeah, yeah, like absolutely. Like most of what I know, as I taught myself, right? And by taught myself, it's doing this stuff, right? This is what I did with the MBTI, right? I dug in and really pieced out what is, sensory, what is the ideas, what is the core of these things, and broke down the binaries. And so, if you are not interested in it, you cannot learn it, right? You can remember it long enough to pass a test, but one of the things that irks me is people like, we'll never use alchemy or algebra in real life. You use algebra every single day as an adult. I've got to get to work. It's X amount of miles away. I have this much gas. Can I make it? Right? How much gas can I get for $20? All of that is algebra, right? Figuring out where you're going and how to get there and the fastest route. That's algebra plus geometry. Like you are using math. It was just taught to you in a boring way, so you rejected it. If you are not interested in it, you're not going to learn it. I cannot force you to learn anything, right? That's why I start my videos. This is not the format for everyone because most people are not going to like the way that I present the information, and that's fine. Right? That's changing, but that's fine. Uh, and so that is absolutely one of those things, right? The autodidacts are responsible for most of the innovations that we have. Tesla, Einstein, uh, Edison, right? All of these people didn't go to formal colleges, or if they did, they failed. They most of them, like Einstein, didn't graduate high school. He fundamentally changed physics simply by thinking about things that he had taught himself because he was interested. If we can get people interested, then we got to think we got something going on. Right? If we can present it in such a way that it is intriguing to the mind of children, then maybe they want to know it. And that's where our problem is. Yes, sir, that individualness still narrows our worldview, reducing that social cohesion. Ego feeds all Luciferian thoughts. But see, you have to be in for your individual experience and right for the group. And that's where the real problem lies because everybody's in for themselves, nobody's in for the group. And if you are in for the group, you're probably in for the wrong group. I mean, those ride or die groups, probably not for your best interest most of the time. Speaking from somebody that definitely came from that. There's light and there is the absence of light. There is heat and there is the absence of heat. Chaos and order, balance and imbalance, equal but opposite. That is absolute truth. And the binary, that's literally existence into the binaries of all of this. And uh, one of my favorite things to point out is that you can't make anything cold. You can only remove heat from it, right? You can only take the positive aspect out. You can't add more of the negative aspect. And so, cold being the representative of the feminine negative aspect, you can't add cold. You can only remove heat. Oh. And so, yeah, yeah. All right. It is often tragic to see how blatantly a man bungles his own life and the lives of others, yet remains totally incapable of seeing how much of the whole tragedy originates in himself and how he continually feeds it and keeps it going. Here. Not consciously, of course, for consciously he is engaged in bewailing and cursing a faithless world that recedes further and further into the distance. Rather, it is an unconscious factor which spin the illusions that veil this world. And what is being spun is a cocoon, which in the end will completely envelop him. Ego reduces collective ideal and leaves us nothing to stand on. Postmodernism expresses this. Yeah, it's all about the balance for me, and that's in everything, right? And there's a time for everything. There's a time to be completely selfish, and then there is a time to be completely selfless, and that is for everyone. And everything else is in the balance. right? Balance yourself to where you are giving to the people appropriately and keeping for yourself appropriately. And that's where the problem lies, right? Everybody wants for me, they don't want for everybody. I mean, that comes down even to our problem with economics currently. I mean, we want the best stuff, the cheapest that we can get it, and even though those are definitely not the same things. Right? And so we have Walmart. Walmart used to be made in America, where we were guaranteeing American jobs and still getting low prices. And now you can almost not find anything made in America, and we're getting low prices. And the consequence of that is not that we're paying decent wages to the people who are creating that. No, no. What we are doing is lowering the production cost for the company who doesn't even dispense that into wages, right? That is a complete imbalance. Shopping at Walmart is terrible. And I do it, right? There are things that I can't get anywhere else. So I shop at Walmart, but I don't buy my meat there, right? If I can buy it somewhere else, I will buy it somewhere else because it, like that, is exactly the problem, right? I want the cheapest, and I don't care that it's coming from slaves. I don't care that. Like the stuff that I do buy at Walmart is toilet paper, paper towels, right? In large quantities. I need that. And so that's about it. Dog food and cat food that I can't get elsewhere. That is what I get there. Oh, and that's a bit of a tangent. Like Walmart's one of my soapboxes. I can give a whole speech for an hour about how Walmart is the bane of our existence. One might assume that projections like these, which are so very difficult, if not impossible to dissolve, would belong to the realm of the shadow. That is, to the negative side of the personality. This assumption becomes untenable after a certain point because the symbols that then appear no longer refer to the same but to the opposite sex. In a man's case, to a woman, and vice versa. This I don't agree with at all. I believe that regardless of your sex, the agent of change within your psyche is going to be the masculine aspect, and the same vice versa. The source of projections is no longer the shadow, which is always of the same sex as the subject, but a contrasexual figure, and I don't agree with that either. Here, we meet the animus of a woman and the anima of a man, two corresponding archetypes whose autonomy and unconsciousness explain the stubbornness of their projections. Though the shadow is a motif as well known to mythology as anima and animus, it represents first and foremost the personal unconscious, and its content can therefore be made conscious without too much difficulty. In this, it differs from anima and animus, from whereas the shadow can be seen through and recognized fairly easily. The anima and animus are much farther away from consciousness, and in normal circumstances are seldom, if ever, realized. With a little self criticism, one can see through the shadow so far as its nature is personal. But when it appears as an archetype, one encounters the same difficulties as with the anima and animus. In other words, it is quite within the bounds of possibility for a man to recognize the relative evil of his nature, but it is a rare and shattering experience for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. Yeah. Curious if you've heard of Ian McGilchrist. His work on the brain split helps add weight to this. I I haven't looked into it. I think you may have brought the name up before because it seems familiar, but I haven't looked into that. Oh, I will try to remember to do so. Yeah. Part three: the syzygy, anima and animus. What then is this projecting making factor? The East calls it the spinning woman, Maya, who creates illusion by her dancing. Had we not long since known it from the symbolism of dreams, this hint from the Orient would put us on the right track. The enveloping, embracing, and devouring element points unmistakably to the mother. That is, to the son's relation to the real mother, to her imago, and to the woman who is to become a mother for him. His eros is passive like a child's. He hopes to be caught, sucked in, enveloped, and devoured. He seeks, as it were, the protecting, nourishing, charm circle of the mother, the condition of the infant, released from every care, in which the outside world bends over him and even forces happiness upon him. No wonder the real world vanishes from sight. If this situation is dramatized, as the unconscious usually dramatizes it, then there appears before you on the psychological stage a man living regressively, seeking his childhood and his mother, fleeing from a cold, cruel world which denies him understanding. Often, a mother appears beside him who apparently shows not the slightest concern that her little son should become a man, but who, with tireless and self immolating effort, neglects nothing that might hinder him from growing up and marrying. You behold the secret conspiracy between mother and son, and how each helps the other to betray life. Where does the guilt lie? With the mother or with the son? Probably with both. The unsatisfied longing of the son for life and the world ought to be taken seriously. There is in him a desire to touch reality, to embrace the earth and fructify the field of the world. But he makes no more than a series of fitful starts, for his initiative as well as his staying power are crippled by the secret memory that the world and happiness may be had as a gift from the mother. The fragment of the world which he, like every man, must encounter again and again is never quite the right one, since it does not fall into his lap, does not meet him halfway, but remains resistant, has to be conquered, and submits only to force. It makes demands on the masculinity of a man, on his ardor, above all, on his courage and resolution when it comes to throwing his whole being into the scales. For this, he would need a faithless Eros, one capable of forgetting his mother and undergoing the pain of relinquishing the first love of his life. The mother, foreseeing this danger, has carefully inculcated into him the virtues of faithfulness, devotion, loyalty, so as to protect him from the moral disruption which is the risk of every life adventure. He has learned these lessons only too well and remains true to his mother. This naturally causes her the deepest anxiety when, to her greater glory, he turns out to be a homosexual, for example. And the same time affords her an unconscious satisfaction that is positively mythological. For, in the relationship now reigning between them, there is consummated the immemorial and most sacred archetype of the marriage of mother and son. What, after all, has commonplace reality to offer, with its registry of offices, pay envelopes, and monthly rent, that could outweigh the mystic awe of the Hyros Gamos, or the star-crowned woman whom the dragon pursues, or the pious obscurities veiling the marriage of the Lamb? This myth, better than any other, illustrates the nature of the collective unconscious. At this level, the mother is both old and young, Demeter and Persephone, and the son is spouse and sleeping suckling rolled into one. The imperfections of real life, with its laborious adaptations and manifold disappointments, naturally cannot compete with such a state of indescribable fulfillment. In the case of the son, the projection making factor is identical with the mother imago, and this is consequently taken to be the real mother. The projection can only be dissolved when the son sees that in the realm of the psyche, there is an imago not only of the mother, but of the daughter, the sister, the beloved, the heavenly goddess, and the chthonic Bobo. Every mother and every beloved is forced to become the carrier and embodiment of this omnipresent and ageless image, which corresponds to the deepest reality in a man. It belongs to him, this perilous image of a woman. She stands for the loyalty which is in the interest of life he must sometimes forego. She is the much needed compensation for the risk, struggles, sacrifices that all end in disappointment. She is the solace for all the bitterness of life. And at the same time, she is the great illusionist, the seductress, who draws him into life with her Maya, and not only into life's reasonable and useful aspects, but into its frightful paradoxes and ambivalences, where good and evil, success and ruin, hope and despair counterbalance one another. Because she is his greatest danger, she demands from man his greatest. And if he has it in him, she will receive it. This image is my lady's soul, as Spittler called her. I have suggested instead the term anima, as indicating something specific for which the expression soul is too general and too vague. The empirical reality summed up under the concept of the anima forms an extremely dramatic content of the unconscious. It is possible to describe this content in rational, scientific language, but in this way, one entirely fails to express its living character. Therefore, in describing the living processes of the psyche, I deliberately and consciously give preference to a dramatic, mythological way of thinking and speaking, because this is not only more expressive, but also more exact than an abstract scientific terminology, which is wont to toy with the notion that its theoretic formulations may one fine day be resolved into algebraic equations. I am currently considering contending with the gravitational law. I think the whole theory is wrong. I find that the math does not work. I cannot let it go. I believe that gravity is a feature of electromagnetism, not mass or distance. I have been dealing an awful lot with physics these days, not with the aim of being a physicist, but I'm putting together a work that I'm calling the Steward's Guide, right? It is foundational from the beginning and the very existence of protons all the way into how to create and keep a garden and be a steward of the earth. Uh, that is specific for a course that one day I want to teach. And so I'm putting that together. And part of that is investigating things, right? And the four fundamental forces of nature, which our understanding of them is the strong and the weak attractive forces, electromagnetism, and gravity. And these exist in a linear way, right? You can chart them, right? I love my charts. And if you chart the strong and the weak and active chart at the top and the bottom, and you put gravity and electromagnetism to the left and the right, there is an effect upon gravity by electromagnetism. And so therefore they are more than likely the opposite ends of a pole, right? In the same way that the weak and the weak and the strong are also probably opposite ends of a pole that we just don't understand the polarity yet, right? Now the strong force is the one that binds the protons together. The weak force is the part that holds together the nucleus and the electrons and attracts the new into the combinations of molecules. Electromagnetism is the result or the the part that is changing, right? So it is a consistent force around the nucleus that is holding the electrons in stasis, but at the same time, it is a force being created by the friction of the position of the electron within the boundary of the strong magnetic force and the strong attractive force and this weak attractive force. And so the electron is kind of sitting in the middle of these two forces, kind of in a groove. And that electromagnetism appears to me to be created from the friction there. That friction is gravity, right? Now, gravity in our understanding of it is definitely got some issues, right? Uh, but it does appear that that particular way of thinking of it in the dipoles may help a lot. Uh, Atoms scale up to the solar system and further into the galaxy. And that is another one of those things, right? The strong attractive force would be the sun and the things inside of the particularity of the sun. And the weak attractive would be the part that is holding the various planets, the electromagnetism that is our shielding, right? They say that it is a rotating ball inside, and that the crust and the mantle rotate around it, and the friction from that is somehow miraculously creating heat. I believe that we do know that there is a connectiveness between stars, right? We have seen that thanks to the new telescopes, and we are able to determine that there is indeed filaments between stars of energetic distribution. our sun is not immune to that particular phenomenon, and that it is receiving from farther out somewheres an emanation of electricity, right? That it distributes. We are also directly tied through filamentarianism. I don't know particularly how to say that, but there is a direct connection between the Earth and the sun on a magnetic level that allows energetic investment into the planet. And so we are riding in that exact same friction spot, creating a magnetic effect in the exact same way that the atoms are, in my estimation. And so that scale up to the solar system for me is 100%. Right? Now, do I claim to know all of the specifics of how that happens? No. Right? But the correlation is absolutely there. Whether it is causative is definitely up for debate. Um, but yeah, oh, the problem with gravity is wow, right? And like our concept of weight is not necessarily based upon gravity in and of itself, because there is a phenomenon, right? You can go to the top of a mountain and you weigh less. We've already seen that. But if you go into a cave system, you also weigh less the farther down you go. That's weird, right? If indeed the gravitational pull is the center of the earth, then it should increase your weight. It does not. And so there is some factor that is not being taken into consideration. A lot of that is going to be atmospheric pressure, right? For sure, right? The weight of all of the air above you is pushing down upon you, holding you into place in very real ways. But it is not the only effect. Oh, and so yeah, that there's a lot. There's a lot. Like I've been consuming so much information. Radioactive decay is there a theoretical source of the internal global heat, magma, hydrothermal venting, etc. Pressure involved too. What keeps planets from diving into the sun? That's going to be their own internal strong attractive force, right? It acts in counterbalance to other strong, and like here's what happens in fission, right? You take two elements, right? We're going to use simple elements, right? We're going to say hydrogen and hydrogen. That is not what happens. But if you take hydrogen and you smash it into hydrogen, and I'm using that because it is one in one, right? What you are doing is trying to create enough velocity with the interjecting proton, which is one proton for each of them, right? The interjecting proton to such a degree that you interrupt the strong gravitational force and connect the two strong gravitational force together. That is exceedingly hard to do, but that is what fission is, right? It's why we don't see it very often. It releases an extraordinary amount of electromagnetics, right? And gravity is definitely going to change, and it becomes a new element from that, right? So there is an enormous strength of magnetism, or the attractive force, which is non-magnetism, which holds them separated. It is the exact same thing that does not let your fingers melt together when you do this. Right? You never actually touch anything. You are held separate by the strong attractive force of the molecules in your fingers or your skin, the epidermis. Right? And so it is small scale, big scale again. But it is our attractive force that solidifies the planet as opposed to the attractive force that solidifies the sun. And the two push against each other and are held by the weak attractive into orbit. And that's what I believe creates the friction. Very interesting discussion. Like these are the things that I want to dive more into, and I cannot get fully into those things by myself. Right? That requires somebody else pushing back on ideas and things. And so I'm really looking forward to the next section. I really am. The projection making factor is the anima, or rather the unconscious as represented by the anima. Whenever she appears in dreams, visions, and fantasies, She takes on a personified form, thus demonstrating that the factor she embodies possesses all the outstanding characteristics of a feminine being. She is not an invention of the conscious, but a spontaneous product of the unconscious, nor is she a substitute figure for the mother. On the contrary, there is every likelihood that the numinous qualities, which make the mother imago so dangerously powerful, derive from the collective archetype of the anima, which is incarnated anew in every male child. Shouldn't it be an equal but opposite force to prevent that? Well, it is, right? The individuation of the strong attractive force for the particularity is the opposite of the one that is defining the other, right? This one is defining this one is defining that, even if it is the exact same this and this, right? This molecule is separated from that molecule. And so it is both an equal and opposite, uh, even if the polarity is the same, right? It is the binary differentiation, though. It's not really the sub archetypes, but the primary archetypes. Ah, and one is differentiating. This is the sun. The other one is differentiating. This is a planet. Um, that seems probable, right? Like again, that's one of those things. I am not the authority on that, right? This is all just spitballing and speculation. Contrasting dualities, opposites correlate more than what our left analytical brain wants to accept. Yeah, 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 yeah. On the contrary, there is every likelihood that the numinous qualities was wait in every male child. Since the anima is an archetype that is found in men, it is reasonable to suppose that an equivalent archetype must be present in women. For just as the man is compensated by a feminine element, so woman is compensated by a masculine one. I do not, however, wish to argument this argument to give the impression that these compensatory relationships were arrived at by deduction. On the contrary, long and varied experience was needed in order to grasp the nature of the anima and animus empirically. Whatever we have to say about these archetypes, therefore, is either directly verifiable or at least rendered probable by the facts. At the same time, I am fully aware that we are discussing pioneer work, which, by its very nature, can only be provisional. Just as the mother seems to be the first carrier of the projection making factor for the son, so is the father for the daughter. Practical experience of these relationships is made up of many individual cases presenting all kinds of variations on the same basic theme. A concise description of them can, therefore, be no more than schematic. Woman is compensated by masculine elements, and therefore her unconscious has, so to speak, a masculine imprint. This results from a considerable psychological difference between men and women, and accordingly, I've called the projection making factor in women the animus, which means mind or spirit. The animus corresponds to the paternal logos, just as the anima corresponds to the maternal eros. But I do not wish or intend to give these two intuitive concepts too specific a definition. I use eros and logos merely as conceptual aids to describe the fact that women's consciousness is characterized more by the connective quality of eros than by the discrimination and cognition associated with logos. In men, eros, the function of relationship is usually less developed than logos. In women, on the other hand, eros is an expression of their true nature, while their logos is often only a regrettable accident. I'm not a fan of the use of logos in this way. Logos is the creative element, and I guess in a way that is the masculine element, but I'm really not digging the way that he is expressing it. It gives rise to misunderstandings and annoying interpretations in the family circle and among friends. This is because it consists of opinions instead of reflections. And by opinions, I mean a priori assumptions that lay claim to absolute truth. Such assumptions, as everyone knows, can be extremely irritating. As the animus is partial to argument, he can best be seen at work in disputes where both parties know they are right. Men can argue in a very womanish way too, when they are anima possessed and have thus been transformed into the animus of their own anima. With them, the question becomes one of personal vanity and touchiness, as if they were females. With women, it is a question of power, whether of truth or justice or some other ism. For the dressmaker and hairdresser have already taken care of their vanity. The father, an example, the sum of conventional opinions, always plays a great role in female argumentation. No matter how friendly or obliging a woman's eros may be, no logic on earth can shake her if she is ridden by the animus. Light with nowhere to go is incomprehensible as absolute darkness. Yes, that is true as well. Without one, you really can't define the other. And otherwise, it is just yes. If there is no no, there is no yes. Often the man has the feeling, and he would not be altogether wrong, that only seduction or a beating or rape would have the necessary power of persuasion. He is unaware that this highly dramatic situation would instantly come to a banal and unexciting end if he were to quit the field and let a second woman carry on the battle. His wife, for instance, if she herself is not the fiery war horse. The sound idea seldom or never occurs to him because no man can converse with an animus for 5 minutes without becoming the victim of his own anima. Anyone who still had enough sense of humor to listen objectively to the ensuing dialogue would be staggered by the vast number of commonplaces, misapplied truisms, cliches from newspapers and novels, shop soiled platitudes of every description interspersed with vulgar abuse and brain splitting lack of logic. Is he talking about then or now? It is a dialogue which, irrespective of its participants, is repeated millions and millions of times in all the languages of the world and always remains essentially the same. This singular fact is due to the following circumstance. When animus and anima meet, the animus draws his sword of power and the anima ejects her poison of illusion and seduction. The outcome need not always be negative, since the two are equally likely to fall in love, a special instance of love at first sight. The language of love is of astonishing uniformity, using the well-worn formulas with the utmost devotion and fidelity, so that, once again, the two partners find themselves in a banal collective situation. Yet, they live in the illusion that they are related to one another in the most individual way. It is both its positive and negative aspects. The anima animus relationship is always full of animosity. An example, it is emotional and hence collective. Effects lower the level of the relationship and bring it closer to the common instinctual basis, which no longer has anything individual about it. Very often, the relationship runs its course, heedless of its human performers, who afterwards do not know what happened to them. Whereas the cloud of animosity surrounding the man is composed chiefly of sentimentality and resentment. In women, it expresses itself in the form of opinionated views, interpretations, insinuations, and misconstructions, which have all have the purpose, sometimes attained, of severing the relation between two human beings. The woman, like the man, becomes wrapped in a veil of illusions by her demon familiar, and, as the daughter who alone understands her father, that is, eternally right in everything, she is translated to the land of sheep, where she is put to graze by the shepherd of her soul, the animus. Morning, Jason. But nowhere to go. I didn't even notice that was you a while ago. Like the animus has a positive aspect. Through the figure of the to the surface, uh, through the figure of the father, he expresses not only conventional opinion, but equally what we call spirit, philosophical or religious ideas in particular. or rather the attitude resulting from them. Thus, the animus is a psychopomp, a mediator between the conscious and the unconscious, and a personification of the latter. Just as the anima becomes, through integration, the eros of the consciousness, so the animus becomes a logos, and in the same way that the anima gives relationship and relatedness to a man's consciousness, the animus gives to a woman's consciousness a capacity for reflection, deliberation, and self knowledge. The effect of anima and animus on the ego is in principle the same. This effect is extremely difficult to eliminate because, in the first place, it is uncommonly strong and immediately fills the ego personality with an unshakable feeling of rightness and righteousness. In the second place, the cause of the effect is projected and appears to lie in objects and objective situations. Both these characteristics can, I believe, be traced back to the peculiarities of the archetype. For the archetype, of course, exists a priori. This may possibly explain the often totally irrational, yet undisputed and indisputable existence of certain moods and opinions. Perhaps these are so notoriously difficult to influence because of the powerfully suggestive effect emanating from the archetype. Consciousness is fascinated by it, held captive, as if hypnotized. Very often, the ego experiences a vague feeling of moral defeat and then behaves all the more defensively, defiantly, and self righteously, thus setting up a vicious circle which only increases its feeling of inferiority. The bottom is then knocked out of the human relationship, for, like megalomania, a feeling of inferiority makes mutual recognition impossible. And without this, there is no relationship. As I said, it is easier to gain insight into the shadow than into the anima or animus. With the shadow, we have the advantage of being prepared in some sort by our education, which has always endeavored to convince people that they are not 100% pure gold. So everyone immediately understands what is meant by shadow, inferior personality, etc. And if he has forgotten, his memory can easily be refreshed by a Sunday sermon, his wife, or the tax collector. With the anima and animus, however, things are by no means so simple. Firstly, there is no moral education in this respect. And secondly, most people are content to be self righteous and prefer mutual vilification, if nothing worse, to the recognition of their projections. Indeed, it seems a very natural state of affairs for men to have irrational moods and women irrational opinions. Presumably, this situation is grounded on instinct and must remain as it is to ensure that the Empedoclean game of the hate and love of the elements shall continue for all eternity. Nature is conservative and does not easily allow her courses to be altered. She defends, in the most stubborn way, the inviolability of the preserves where anima and animus roam. Hence, it is much more difficult to become conscious of one's anima, animus projections, than to acknowledge one's shadow side. One has, of course, to overcome certain moral obstacles, such as vanity, ambition, conceit, resentment, etc. But in the case of projections, all sorts of purely intellectual difficulties are added, quite apart from the contents of the projection, which simply doesn't know how to cope with. And on top of all this, there arises a profound doubt as to whether one is not meddling too much with nature's business by prodding into consciousness things which it would have been better to leave asleep. Although there are, in my experience, a fair number of people who can understand without special intellectual or moral difficulties what is meant by anima and animus, one finds very many more who have the greatest trouble in visualizing these empirical concepts as anything concrete. This shows that they fall a little outside the usual range of experience. They are unpopular precisely because they seem unfamiliar. The consequence is that they mobilize prejudice and become taboo, like everything else that is unexpected. So, if we set up as the kind of requirement that projections should be dissolved because it is wholesomer that way and in every respect more advantageous, we are entering upon new ground. Up until now, everybody has been convinced that the idea, my father, my mother, etc., is nothing but a faithful recollection of the real parent, corresponding in every detail to the original, so that when someone says, my father, he means no more and no less than what his father is in reality. This is actually what he supposes he does mean, but a supposition of identity by no means brings that identity about. This is where the fallacy of the enkyklamenimos, the veiled one, comes in. If one includes the psychological equation X's picture of his father, which he takes for the real father, the equation will not work out because the unknown quantity he has introduced does not tally with reality. X has overlooked the fact that his idea of a person consists, in the first place, of the possibly very incomplete picture he has received of the real person, and, in the second place, of the subjective modifications he has imposed upon that picture. X's idea of his father is a complex quantity for which the real father is only in part responsible, and indefinitely larger share falling to the son. So true is this that every time he criticizes or praises his father, he is unconsciously hitting back at himself, thereby bringing about those sick consequences that overtake people who habitually disparage or overpraise themselves. If, however, X carefully compares his reactions with reality, he stands a chance of noticing that he has miscalculated somewhere by not realizing long ago from his father's behavior that the picture he has of him is a false one. But as a rule, X is convinced that he is right, and if anybody is wrong, it must be the other fella. Should X have a poorly developed eros, he will be either indifferent to the inadequate relationship he has with his father, or else annoyed by the inconsistency and general incomprehensibility of a father whose behavior never really corresponds to the picture X has of him. Therefore, X thinks he has every right to feel hurt, misunderstood, and even betrayed. One can imagine how desirable it would be in such cases to dissolve the projection. And there are always optimists who believe that the golden age can be ushered in simply by telling people the right way to go. That's me. That's me. I'm that guy. But just let them try to explain to these people that they are acting like a dog chasing his own tail. To make a person see the shortcomings of his attitude, considerably more than telling is needed. For more is involved than any ordinary common sense can allow. Yeah, nobody wants to listen. Like, you cannot give unsolicited advice, it does you no good. What one is up against here is the kind of fateful misunderstanding which, under ordinary conditions, remains forever inaccessible to insight. It is rather like expecting the average respectable citizen to recognize himself as a criminal. I mention all this just to illustrate the order of magnitude to which the anima animus projections belong and the moral and intellectual exertions that are needed to dissolve them. Not all the contents of the anima and animus are projected, however. Many of them appear spontaneously in dreams and so on, and many more can be made conscious through active imagination. In this way, we find that thoughts, feelings, and effects are alive in us, which we would never have believed possible. Yeah, I actually fear giving bad advice and causing more harm than if I just kept my mouth shut. And see, I don't offer advice, right? If someone asks me for advice, I will give it, right? And almost every single time that I give somebody advice, they don't take it and it works out badly for them, right? And I still wind up giving it to them, knowing full well that they're not going to take what would actually help them in their life. And I could pull specific instances, but that is telling other people's business, and I don't do that. Naturally, possibilities of this sort seem utterly fantastic to anyone who has not experienced them himself. For a normal person knows what he thinks. No, they do not. Such a childish attitude on the part of the normal person is simply the rule, so that no one without experience in this field can be expected to understand the real nature of anima and animus. With these reflections, one gets into an entirely new world of psychological experience, provided, of course, that one succeeds in realizing it in practice. Those who do succeed can hardly fail to be impressed by all that the ego does not know and has never known. This increase in self knowledge is still very rare nowadays and is usually paid for in advance with a neurosis, if not something worse. The autonomy of the collective unconscious expresses itself in the figures of the anima and animus. They personify those of its contents, which, when withdrawn from projection, can be integrated into consciousness. To this extent, both figures represent functions, which filter the contents of the collective unconscious through the conscious mind. They appear or behave as such, however, only so long as the tendencies of the conscious and unconscious do not diverge too greatly. Should any tension arise, these functions, harmless till then, confront the conscious mind in personified form and behave rather like systems split off from the personality or like part souls. This comparison is inadequate insofar as nothing previously belonging to the ego personality has split off from it. On the contrary, the two figures represent a disturbing accretion. The reason for their behaving in this way is that though the contents of anima and animus can be integrated, they themselves cannot, since they are archetypes. As such, they are the foundation stones of the psychic structure, which in its totality exceeds the limits of consciousness and therefore can never become the object of direct cognition. I try to approach by saying where I am at and how I got there without prescribing the path to anyone because my path is my own path and likely very different from theirs. My frame is not transferable. Yeah, that's a lot where I'm at too. Right. I try to be a light of balance. I mean, to show that I have it in my life now. I have chosen to make myself an example in a very public way. And so the way that I do it is not one that I recommend to other people, right? I have chosen to be this part, right? You need to do it in a way that is good for you because not everybody works in the same way. The best that I can do is show I've had effects in my life and they have been positive because of these things. You can try them out. And if you want to and it works, that's good. And if you want to and it doesn't, that's good too, right? That's at least some knowledge that we didn't have before. And that's how I really look at it. Like, if you ask me, I can tell you in extreme detail all of the things that you want to know, but you're probably going to ignore half of them. And that is with asking, right? And again, like very specific situations where somebody's like, what should I do? And I tell them with the reasoning, and they still do the opposite. And it works out exactly like I told them it would. And then they do it again. Though the effects of anima and animus can be made conscious, they themselves are factors transcending consciousness and beyond the reach of perception and volition. Drop the ego subjective frame, and the problem becomes more easily digestible. Not a total loss of ego, but a hierarchy of importance. My stepmom bought me a shirt that says, I can explain it to you, but I can't make you understand it. That. Hence, they remain autonomous despite the integration of their contents, and for this reason, they should be borne constantly in mind. This is extremely important from the therapeutic standpoint because constant observation pays the unconscious a tribute that more or less guarantees its cooperation. The unconscious, as we know, can never be done with once and for all. It is, in fact, one of the most important tasks of psychic hygiene to pay continual attention to the symptomology of unconscious contents and processes for the good reason that the conscious mind is always in danger of becoming one sided, of keeping to well worn paths and getting stuck in blind alleys. The complementary and compensating function of the unconscious ensures that these dangers, which are especially great in neuroses, can in some measure be avoided. It is only under ideal conditions, when life is still simple and unconscious enough to follow the serpentine path of instinct without hesitation or misgiving, that the compensation works with entire success. The more civilized, the more unconscious and complicated a man is, unless he is able to follow his instincts. His complicated living conditions and the influence of his environment are so strong that they drown the quiet voice of nature. Opinions, beliefs, theories, and collective tendencies appear in its stead and back up all the aberrations of the conscious mind. Deliberate attention should, then, be given to the unconscious so that the compensation can set to work. Hence, it is equally important to picture the archetypes of the unconscious not as a rushing phantasmagoria but of fugitive images, but as constant, autonomous factors, which indeed they are. Both of these archetypes, as practical experience shows, possess a fatality that can on occasion produce tragic results. They are quite literally the father and mother of all disastrous entanglements of fate and have long been recognized as such by the whole world. Together they form a divine pair, one of whom, in accordance with his logos nature, is characterized by pneuma and nous, rather like Hermes with his ever-shifting hues, while the other, in accordance with her eros nature, wears the features of Aphrodite, Helen, Selene, Persephone, and Hecate. Both of them are unconscious powers, gods, in fact, as the ancient world quite rightly conceived them to be. I agree with that. To call them by this name is to give them that central position in the scale of psychological values, which has always been theirs, whether consciously acknowledged or not. For their power grows in proportion to the degree that they remain unconscious. Those who do not see them are in their hands, just as a typhus epidemic flourishes best when its source is undiscovered. Even in Christianity, the divine syzygy has not become obsolete, but occupies the highest place as Christ and his bride, the church. Parallels like this prove extremely helpful in our attempts to find the right criterion for gauging the significance of these two archetypes. What we can discover about them from the conscious side is so slight as to be almost imperceptible. It is only when we throw light into the dark depths of the psyche and explore the strange and tortuous paths of human fate that it gradually becomes clear to us how immense is the influence wielded by these two factors that complement our conscious life. We control how we interpret the actions of others regardless of their intent. I have found after years of trying that there is no guarantee of being received as we intend. A person's frame dictates how they interpret our actions and our words. Yes, absolutely. And you can see that real time in current day politics. And I'm not going to get into the specific examples, but someone can say something and both sides can take something completely different from it. And again, that's not putting any specificity on it because it is literally both sides, literally doing it all the time. Recapitulating, I should like to emphasize that the integration of the shadow, or the realization of personal unconscious, marks the first stage in the analytic process, and that without it, a recognition of anima and animus is impossible. The shadow can be realized only through a relation to a partner, and anima and animus only through a relation to a partner of the opposite sex. Because only in such a relation do their projections become operative. The recognition of the anima gives rise, in a man, to a triad, one third of which is transcendent, the masculine subject, the opposing feminine subject, and the transcendent anima. With a woman, the situation is reversed. The missing fourth element that would make the triadic quaternity is, in a man, the archetype of the wise old man, which I have not discussed here, and in a woman, the chthonic mother. These four constitute a half immanent and half transcendent quaternity, an archetype, which I have called the marriage quaternion. The marriage quaternion provides a schema not only for the self, but also for the structure of primitive society with its cross cousin marriage, marriage classes, and division of settlements into quarters. The self, on the other hand, is a God image, or at least cannot be distinguished from one. Of this, the early Christian spirit was not ignorant. Otherwise, Clement of Alexandria could never have said that he who knows himself knows God. Jesus told you that the kingdom is within. And because of time, we are not going to get into the self. We will reserve that till the next one. So that is going to bring us to the end of this particular study. And hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a series of somewhat difficult topics. I understand that I hold some unconventional beliefs, and I do have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something that I apologize for. All thanks to the ego manipulating our perspectives, less ego, less conflicting tension. One side says 6, the other says 9. That is true, but that particular meme annoys the absolute fuck out of me because somebody wrote that number. And that number had an intention when it was put there. It had a purpose. And even if you are looking at it and it is relative to you, that does not mean that there is not an objective purpose and a correct answer to that number. That meme annoys the absolute fuck out of me because it is in large way relative to your viewpoint. But there is objectively a correct answer to the question. It is amazing that we are able to achieve any semblance of actual communication due to the subjective nature of our brain and its translation aspect to interpret the world around us. Yes, the objective goal is more important than our petty egotistical squabbles. Yes, yes. And that's the point, right? That's why that meme annoys me so bad, is because it's not the 6 and the 9 that's the problem, right? It is the cutting off of genitalia that is the problem. It is the enabling of the shadow instead of the assimilation of the shadow that is the problem. And that relative moralism of, well, I perceive it this way, so it might be, is in some cases objectively wrong, right? And so it is always an abomination to kill a child. Every single instance, whether that is fetal or not. And so to consider that to be a moral relativism is a big problem. And that's one that I hold, right? That is one of the things that I contend with because I absolutely cannot partake of that which I morally object to. I cannot watch TV because I morally object to the things that they portray on TV. I don't partake in, like, if you express yourself in a way that I know is intrinsically opposed to the betterment of humankind, I will not partake of your stuff, right? You can go back through my reactions. That is why I never reacted to the big names. I could have chased that and made that happen, but I object morally to most of the things that they stand for personally, and so I cannot promote them in any way, shape, or form. And so a lot of it is relative. A lot of it really is morally relative and subjective, but some of it just absolutely intrinsically is not. And the hard part is differentiating when it is just an argument over perspective and when it is an argument over, hey, you are just objectively wrong, right? It is objectively wrong to kill a child. Without the line at the base of the number, it is difficult to interpret accurately. Yes, and that's the big problem with most of the historical texts. The illusion of duality harms us all. Once it fades, objectivity becomes the glue that holds us together in loving. I agree with that. No TV for years, and after very few shows that I watch online either. It's easier to avoid than to parse through the social garbage. Yeah, it really is. Like, I don't miss it. Like, the only part about movies that I miss was watching them with my wife. Right? I don't miss the actual physicality of just sitting around watching. And like most of what I consume, like I consume so much content, but most of it is things that are physics or math or science or spirituality, things that I don't agree with so that I can broaden my perspective. I mean, almost none of it is fantastical content, just created whole cloth out of nothing. Almost none of it is dramatization content. Like even my news sources, I backed off of Timcast because it was getting too much for me. right? And that's not even that he spends it. He's very middle of the road, but even he is starting to get very bipolar in a lot of ways that is upsetting for me. And so, yeah. And so it is so much easier just to avoid. But one of the things that I have identified about myself is that I have a tendency to do that with people as well. Right? If I don't agree with you 100%, then I just won't associate with you. And it's not even inimical, right? I don't mean it in a bad way. It's just that I'm looking for something to sharpen me. And if something isn't sharpening me, then it's kind of making me dull, right? And so if you're not bringing value, I have a tendency to just, and that's not in every circumstance, right? I'm really bad about just forgetting myself and people exist. I say all the time, I'm a terrible Discordian because I forget that Discord exists for months. Right? Uh, and so one of the things that I'm working through is still allowing people that I know to be erroneous into me. Right? And that's a problem. And into me is the wrong way to frame that. But STEM, philosophy, history, space weather, 2A, and firearms research. There you go. I do a lot of agriculture too, right? I investigate how to grow things, and like physics has been a big deal here recently because of the one endeavor. But like I'm putting together presentations of all of this. Like this is really the last study that I'm doing in this way. This is the last gasp of let's read along and just discuss. From here on out, it's going to be just discussing with some corresponding references thrown in. I'm really trying to pivot away from that so that I can be more of the content to be consumed. Right? If I'm out there lighting the way, then maybe somebody can see the light. Nobody's really watching me read a book. This has been about me, right? This has been me learning the things that I need to go out and do. Struggling challenge to accept others despite their understandings. Forgive them for what that Father, for they know not what they do. Yes, indeed. We can meet up on my Discord and engage in discussions on topics of consequence. I'm looking for someone to play chess with. Have not had any luck today. And I know how to play chess, but I really don't I don't derive entertainment from it. Like I know that some people do. I got a friend, like he plays chess all the time. And I say a friend, we haven't talked since like middle school, but and we definitely hold some very different beliefs. Ah, but like I want to say that I would do that. I really want to say that, but it's probably not going to happen. Like I'm wanting to pivot into real life discussions. I want to get in front of people and start presenting this information, but I don't know that I'll ever be a Discordian. Right? I don't know that I will ever be somebody who just jumps on Discord to talk. I kind of want to develop that type of thing, but I don't know that I am. And it's really hard for me to talk to people. It's hard for me to invite myself into a conversation. And it's really hard for me to reach out to people. It's something that I am working on, but I'm not good at it. Jason can tell you, right? I've been telling him for like, what, 5 months now that we're going to reach out about reading through the Maleficorium, the Catholic, here's how you tell what a witch is. And I just haven't because that's who I am. I'm a pretty good questioner. Yes, you are. Right? We've had some really good discussions, and hopefully, I I'm pivoting away from this. Hopefully, we'll still be in a live format at least once a week with the openness for questions. Uh, I want to be more available in that way. Right? I like this, and I don't want you to think that this is taking away from this. But in the study, it's kind of taken away from that. And that's why I want to pivot because having this type of discussion with the comments is much more what I am interested in at this point. I've kind of learned what I needed to learn from Young. I mean, I am doing this because I promised y'all that I would. And there is the potential for some discussion in this, the finalization of several of the ideas that are going to be presented. But for the most part, like this really is just for the crew. And in the transition period, because I definitely am not ready to jump into the other. But I kind of have to be fairly quickly. But anyway, that's where I'm going to go ahead and wrap this one up. Thanks, guys, for hanging out. I know a lot about topics to ask informed questions at least, and try not to take a position of knowing. Growing, learning versus growing. Yeah. Like an open mind gets you a long way, like a really long way. Uh, Especially when you're dealing with things that cannot really ever be firm. You can't say that you know what's in eternity. You haven't been there, and you may have been, but you got amnesia. So thanks for hanging out, guys. If y'all found value, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, follow, throw me a comment. Whether you agree or disagree with anything that was stated, put it in the box. And if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you truly found value, I ask that you hit the super thanks. Consider joining for a membership, picking up a copy of one of my books, or reaching out to me through the links provided down below. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete, just the way that you are. And this has been Pittstake. Peace. Have a good one, y'all.